6. Women can change their men. When the chemistry is working between the two sexes, a man will do anything to please his woman. Kings have abdicated thrones to keep the woman they love. Morris always used to say to me that our children must never come between us. He married me, not the children. The children were a consequence of our relationship and should never get in between us. One day they will be of age to find their own partner and leave the home, so set up a new family and feel no qualms about doing so. It is important that man and wife maintain their unique relationship. Morris would do anything rather than lose my love, and this is the area where my power lies as a woman. Morris and I have always had a very special friendship, as we've been in the ministry together since the ark almost. There was a very big difference between us though. I knew I'd been singled out for something by God from a very early age and wanted with all my heart to be more spiritual and godly. I used to go off on holidays, either with special friends or on my own, to fast or just seek God. As I was the church secretary, I just loved to converse with the pastor about God and the church for hours and threw myself 100% into living the life of a disciple. Morris, on the other hand, said that there were two classes of Christians, the practical ones and the spiritual ones. He preferred to be the practical Christian. Nevertheless, when he saw me getting more spiritual and godly, it provoked him, in a good way, to jealousy, and he would jump onto my bandwagon. This irritated me at times, as I thought I was always leading him, and as he was older than I, and the minister's son, I expected him to be the one leading me. The more time I spent with God, the more I changed in attitude and spirituality, and this seemed to provoke Morris to become godly more than anything else that I did. Because I was the minister's secretary, and his youngest daughters, who were Morris's sisters, were my friends, I spent quite a bit of time round at their house. During these visits, the minister, his wife, and myself would often end up praying together, and God would invariably show us things in vision. Sometimes Morris's sisters would join us, and we would have a family meeting. I would tell Morris all that had happened, relating the visions and enthusing about how God was so good to us. I could see the effect it had on him. He was really pleased for me, but I knew that he was also jealous and a little frustrated that he wasn't included. I felt for him and mentioned to his parents how he was feeling, so they told me to invite him round for the evening family meeting. Morris made time, thrilled to bits that he was now part of it, and I know it thrilled his parents to see him making moves towards spirituality rather than practicality. They must have been praying for him for years, as they knew what an ambitious man he was. His determination had already earned him a place on the England gymnastic team during his youth, and he was working towards becoming rich and famous, as his heart's desire was to be a millionaire. God really spoke to us in those days, and we all changed radically. The minister and his immediate family went away on holiday, so I house sat for them. I decided that I would use this time in their house to seek God and told Morris of my intention. He wanted to be a part of it, obviously. So we decided he could come round during his lunch hour from work when we could seek God together. One day, as Morris and I were praying together in his parents' lounge, God gave me a vision. In this vision, my hair began to grow. I was sitting in the chair opposite Morris, and the hair from my head just kept growing, flowing down my body, creeping across the floor to where Morris was sitting, travelling up Morris's body until it reached the top of his head where his bald patch was. It then began to burrow through his scalp and get into his head, where it eventually reached the nerve points at the top of his spine, at the back of his neck. The hair fastened itself firmly to the nerve endings and stopped growing. From the outside of his body, I could grab hold of the hair on top of his head and pull it upwards. As I did so, I could see his body jump and reflex, rather like a chicken's foot when you pull the sinews. But just then I saw a hand reach down from heaven, holding a pair of scissors. The scissors severed the hair, leaving a good few centimetres exposed, and then tied a knot in the part that was still attached to Morris. Then the hand put the scissors down and began to do exactly what I had been doing, pulling the knotted hair upwards. Morris's limbs jumped up and down as they had done when I had pulled them, but now it was God pulling the strings rather than me. God was now in control. Well, after this vision, my heart soared to think that God was promising to answer our prayers and take full control of Morris. Shortly after this, Morris began to make even more of a progression and started calling in to see his father before commencing work in the mornings. He would sometimes drop me off at work and then carry on to his parents' house, where he would spend an hour each day talking with his dad, as he didn't start work until 10:30. Things were looking up. I knew what effect Morris's father had on me, so I could only imagine what it must have been like for Morris. Things changed. It wasn't long before he was hot for God, then burning. He began to make radical moves, even to the point where he decided to leave work and go full-time in the ministry for God. His father got really scared when he told him about his decision, asking him what had brought this about. "You're preaching, Dad. No point being challenged unless you're going to do something about it. No, I've made my mind up. Whatever the cost, I'm going for God." I was so proud of him. Actually, I'm not really supposed to use that word, proud, because pride comes before a fall, and God resists the proud. Behold everyone that is proud and abase him. Look on everyone that is proud and bring him low. The Lord shall cut off all flattering lips and the tongue that speaks proud things. These are all scriptures from the Bible. Though the Lord be high, yet he has respect unto the lowly, but the proud he knows afar off. The Lord will destroy the house of the proud. Everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. For the day of the Lord of hosts shall be upon everyone that is proud and lofty, and upon everyone that is lifted up, and he shall be brought low. Am I convinced you? Nevertheless, I was really blessed to see Morris change. Not because I was pushing him, but because the Lord was now doing it. I can't tell you how blessed I felt that at last God was going to manipulate Morris so that he could be the man and lead me. I'd waited for so long, and I could only see this change as positive. What I didn't realise, of course, was that Morris was really catching up to me in the things he was doing. I had gone full-time long before, so he wasn't actually challenging or leading me, and because of this I felt very comfortable with the changes that were taking place in him. It was when we got married and had our first child that the impact of that vision really hit me, and it wasn't pleasant at all. A new haircut. For a period, our little boy came between us as I was preoccupied with my new baby, who always seemed to want my attention at exactly the same moment Morris wanted it. He demanded so much of my time and energy. I was no longer available 24/7 for Morris, and he knew it. He now took second place as I attended to this vulnerable little child. Morris felt pushed out and resented it. Because he couldn't talk to me without being distracted, he began to talk to others about the revelations he was getting from God. I felt as though I'd lost my best friend and prayer partner. Of course, it was all good and of God, but the cutting of the hair, the separation we experienced, was extremely painful and bewildering for both of us. But I've learned that God allows what he hates to achieve what he loves. He wanted to be Morris's God, his only God. He didn't want him to have any other props. He had to get me out of the way for Morris to have the right relationship with him. Now, because I'm in the position where I support and uphold my husband instead of it being the other way around as it was before, the relationship with God is right and we have order in the home. My husband now receives direction personally from God how to lead his family, and I'm happy to come under my husband. He is my covering. In all matters, the most important thing where decision-making is concerned is unity. If there is something Maurice wants to do which I feel differently about, even in matters of praying to God in faith for something, I've decided that unity must be maintained at all costs, for God will not listen to either of us if we don't have it. If Maurice can't see the problem from my point of view, then always I will come under him. God is not the author of confusion. My head, my husband, will have to answer to God for wrong decisions. I must emphasize at this point that I was working with good material. My husband wanted God deep down, even though the world had a tremendous pull on him. He wanted the same things everyone else wants: fame, wealth, privacy, independence, and did everything he could think of to attain these things. But God could see what was in the depths of his heart and allowed me to partner up with him. I waited until I was 37 years old for the man of God's choice for me, and I know without a shadow of a doubt that he gave me Maurice. If God put us together, then we have an obligation to get it right, because God knows perfection is achievable. I know of another woman whose Christian husband had been a firebrand, preaching and witnessing unrelentlessly for the Lord, but for some reason God allowed him to fall from grace into sin. For years he would come home in the small hours of the morning with lipstick on the collars of his shirts, smelling of women's perfume. He drank until he was inebriated, and emotionally he abused his wife and did his best to make her leave and divorce him, but she wouldn't. She would wash his lipstick, stained clothes, cook his meals, maintain the home, and pray for him. She wouldn't fight with him, and for 10 long years she took her tears and prayers to the Lord. The man was tormented. No backslider is at peace when they are away from God. But somehow, in his own way, God restored this man's faith and marriage. His wife's prayerful, meek and quiet spirit had won him back to loving her, and when he died, some years later, he was in his own bed, cuddling his own wife. On the other hand, I knew a really godly man who worked with us for the space of 20 years. Such a brother was so rare. He was a gem, being polished by the Lord. Everywhere he went, people spoke well of him, remarking on the fact that such a talented man had the ability to serve. He had totally committed himself to God, was humble, full of integrity, absolutely trustworthy, and had decided to live a life of celibacy until God changed his lifestyle. My husband, Maurice, and I trained him up, brought him into the ministry, and sent him to other countries to represent Barratt Ministries. He'd even learned to live by faith and trust God for all his needs, like we did. Of course, he had no financial commitments, as the expenses of Barratt Ministries were our responsibility. But he looked to God to provide him with clothes and holidays, and God always looked after him. He won our complete confidence. When Maurice and I were out on ministry, we would leave him in charge of our 3 small children with absolute peace in our hearts, knowing that if something happened to us to prevent us from returning, they were in the safest hands possible. He earned our deepest love and respect, and our children saw him as part of the family. For 20 years, Maurice and I had waited for a vision regarding a crunchy maple leaf falling to the ground and causing the explosion to be fulfilled. Obviously, when you're given a vision from the Lord, you don't always know fully how it is going to work out practically. But we felt it had something to do with Canada. So, when a Canadian couple who had seen and heard us minister in a church in Manchester asked us if we would minister in their country, we took this as God beginning to work the vision out and went to Canada. Many doors opened to us. We not only spoke in house groups and churches, but we were also interviewed on radio and television. One of the young boys who had been greatly affected by my testimony at a youth meeting asked his mother, a Chinese woman who had been widowed for the previous 10 years, to invite Maurice and me and the couple who were hosting us to dinner. During the meal, God suddenly came upon me, and I prophesied over the dinner table and told the woman, whom I had met for the very first time, that God had called her to a different lifestyle than the one she was leading at present, a life of sacrifice and faith. She later revealed to me that she had been rebuking this in the name of Jesus under her breath as I was speaking. We all knew God was there in the midst of us, for his presence was so strong. When we were back in England, I received an email from her asking if it would be possible for her and her 2 children to come to our house for a retreat within the next few weeks, as it was still their summer vacation. I knew in my spirit that this was no ordinary request. God was at work. I spoke with Morris and told him I thought God was sending her to be a wife for the man who worked with us, as God had been preparing us with visions and prophecies during recent months. Morris felt exactly the same. The woman also knew why she was coming, for her future husband, as God has directed her to his profile and teaching on our website. But she was waiting for God to reveal it to him. We didn't breathe a word of this to the man. We just waited to see what God would do. During her stay with us, she went to some of the house group meetings with Morris, but on other occasions went with the man who was working with us, as when Morris's teachings had come to an end, he followed up with further studies of a different nature. On these occasions, she was alone with him whilst they travelled, but he was totally unaware of her as a woman or her mission. As the 2-week stay with us neared to an end, she confided to us that she didn't think he knew what a woman was. 2 evenings before her flight to Canada, the woman had gone to a house group meeting with Morris, and I was in the garden with my children. This man came out to sit with us, and we got into conversation. He'd been thinking strange things. Eventually, he came to the conclusion that God had sent this woman to be his wife. "Well, go and get her then," I said. He was 49 years old, but was giggling incredulously like a little boy. If God had gone to all the trouble of preparing a Chinese woman and bringing her to him all the way from Canada, then nothing could be easier. He would ask her to marry him the very next morning so that they could make the necessary arrangements before she returned home the day after. True to his word, at the very earliest opportunity, he knocked on her door and asked her 2 questions. The first being, "The Lord has shown me that you are to be my wife. Will you marry me?" She said she would. But then he said, "Will you come to live with me at Barratt Ministries, for this is where the Lord has called me?" She hadn't anticipated this question, so there was quite a bit of deliberation. He was asking her to sell up her house in Canada, leave her mother, relatives, church and friends, and bring her 2 children to live in a house shared by other people and to live by faith. Now, this was different. She was an accountant by profession. She couldn't get her head around how he was going to provide for her and her kids, and asked him endless questions about our finances and the way we operated. At last, she agreed to this question also, but told a friend of hers, who was also a friend of mine, that she would go along with him for a year or 2, then move into her own place. Her sister-in-law, who came over to England for the wedding, shared with me the family joke that her nickname was Tsunami. From the moment she agreed to his terms, the man changed. The carefree, happy man became fearful and burdened. He lost his appetite, and within a few months lost around 40 pounds. Retreating into himself, he became hard to communicate with, and I was really concerned for his health. On the one occasion I got through to him, he shared his fears, saying that he could understand David when he talked of the terrors that had come upon him in the Psalms, that horror had overwhelmed him. He wasn't afraid of marriage. He was afraid of this woman, for she was too strong for him. The worst thing was that he wasn't in love with her. He was marrying her because God had told him to. He became a puppet in her hands. She was ambitious and manipulated him easily because he had a servant heart and knew how to please. They were married within 6 months of meeting, and she managed, unbelievably, to turn his heart away from us completely. They left Barratt Ministries just after 2 months. The week following, he sent us a 5-page typewritten letter, hers was 9 pages long, giving the reasons why he had left, saying that he realized now that for 20 years he had been misused and abused by us. God had intended him to be the man, to marry and be a leader in his household. But she was the one who was wearing the trousers from the day he popped the question.